the healthcare system is about working with the people. And model implementation is actually more about adoption, trust, and ownership of that model and that effort by the clinicians and the innovators that work with them, as well as the patients themselves and the clinicians, to move it forward rather than just saying that here's a tool, here's a thing, take it or leave it. A single life matters. And so if we make even a single mistake with that technology, right, that one life that you sacrificed is worth a lot more than losing $1. Hi everybody, my name is Evelyn. I am a PhD candidate at the National University of Singapore, working on artificial intelligence, specifically with healthcare, and I also own a company on the side that primarily works in medical software deployment, so design, development, deployment. Of course, that includes a level of artificial intelligence. It's not the only one we work on, but as you can tell, my focus is primarily in healthcare.
All right. And Evelyn has been with us last night, and she's one of our Hive leads as well. And we're right here in Singapore this week. We're spending a lot of time with her. So you operate in a domain where the stakes are very high. Like when someone makes a mistake, especially in AI, Gen AI,
you're screwed.
It's like someone's life is like, So how do you navigate that scenario as a consultant?
I think the thing that may not be super obvious to people is that I've been in healthcare for a relatively long time. When I was in Berkeley, I was doing pre-med, which means I was actually a tech and then emergency department for a good 5 years. So part-time, but you're talking like East Oakland, gunshots every day kind of situation. So as far as situations where people's lives are directly in my hands, that's something that I'm used to. And so it was sort of natural for me to be able to stay in healthcare and handle that level of pressure. Ultimately, what we're doing is still impactful, and the only aspect where the fact that we're working with people's lives, the only thing that does for me is that it makes sure that I'm a lot more serious and a lot more conscientious about my work. It doesn't really scare me anymore. I think potentially it should scare a lot of people because obviously if you make a mistake, it costs lives potentially. But that just makes me more determined to ensure that a lot of the work that we do is high quality and is usable and is deployable and can do the work that it needs to do in aiding other people to save more lives. That's really most of the focus there.
And typically in the kind of projects that you do, I could imagine that, to take this work seriously means that data must be absolutely secure, privacy, considerations are made, and the performance has to be very good. What are your takes on that statement?
I'm very, very into everything being super secure. I'm very into the whole data consent thing. Also not obvious, but my background in UC Berkeley was actually in legal studies. So as far as like drafting contracts and being super on top of the privacy statements and everything and working with that kind of jurisdiction legislatively goes, I'm probably the one on my team that's the most into all of that. That obviously takes on a different meaning outside of ethical argument. It takes on a different meaning when you're looking at it on a technical perspective. Now, I'm going to try not to go a lot into this, but there's a reason why we have a cybersecurity expert on the team, just making sure that a lot of our systems hit both international as well as local frameworks in terms of cybersecurity. And then each individual hospital or clinic or system, typically, if it's a larger institution like a hospital or a research institution, they usually have their own systems in place that we just need to adapt to, and then we will work with them. For smaller customers, they typically are not so sure, and then we advise them. And that typically, depending on whether it's a B2B, B2C installation in a hospital versus a consumer type thing, then we'll advise them on what to do with their encryption levels moving forward. But it's something that I take very, very seriously because there's a lot that you can do with protected health information. I don't really want my health information out there. I don't think anybody wants their health information out there. And so, again, for the sake of patient trust, clinician trust, everybody to be able to trust the system, it becomes very important that we ourselves take it seriously.
And you talked about encryption and failsafes, those kinds of things. How do you consider that, when approaching AI for the healthcare space?
I think so. Unlike with a lot of other startups or a lot of other efforts where you're able to take a lot of open source models, and we were discussing this with Timothy earlier outside, but we primarily work with our own internal models. So we develop custom models for more than anything else. So I have a suite of models that I'm used to working with, and I typically use some level of variation of them in order to optimize for the fact that we can't use open source models. I'll admit, of course, that they're not potentially going to be the same. I've never actually tried to compare their performance because I can't pass our data through open source models, so I can't compare their performance. I think based on peripheral understanding is that the models that we're using may not be as good as the open source models, but the benefit of using the models that we're using, especially because my PhD is in healthcare AI, is that they are in fact very specialized to healthcare data sets and optimizing for healthcare discrepancies, minutiae, and data sets. And so potentially in all actuality, I genuinely think the custom models are not too bad. And the custom models are one thing. We run them on local servers, so our own servers more than open source or like
and you were talking about
cloud
taking
service.
your consultancy and data center.
Yes, a little bit. We have a lot of our projects, if they're with the institutions, everybody looked at it and was like, can we just have our own servers? And now we have to look at, encryption of data at rest, data storage and all of that. And a lot of our work ends up being just, here's a server, let's configure the server to the standards that you need, and then let's maintain a lot of that. And that makes it more workable to work with a lot of the institutions, because the truth of it is the larger cloud platforms, they usually do have a relationship with the university, but the paperwork and bureaucracy is just so difficult to navigate for the individual researcher that they almost always prefer to just look at it and be like, let's just maintain our own server, because it's just really not worth it for them sometimes. So the downside is I have very little experience in working with a lot of open source models. I have very little understanding of how to apply a lot of them other than my own projects, which are not part of this. Those are just for fun. And I have very little understanding of how to use a lot of the cloud-based servers and how to run them, again, other than my own projects, which are typically limited, and I'm not so focused on them right now. Like, I'll do my own separate projects on this side, which have nothing to do with healthcare and everything to do with my other interest, which is books.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So I'll do a lot of those, and the data is all available. I don't need to encrypt them. I don't need to deal with localized servers, so I'm not going to use those resources to run them. I'll just use GCP, whatever the free cloud credits, and just run those, and those are okay. But otherwise, everything that we do for the most part is just very strictly hidden behind either individual client walls or our own walls as well. And as much as possible, we genuinely really, really try not to expose that to anything else. So we try to be very careful with that.
All right. Looks like you have a strong...
very, very strong opinions on this. Because the problem with that, especially in healthcare, right, is once that trust is broken, it's very hard to get it back. You make mistakes. Of course, I think everybody makes mistakes, right? But it's so important for us to be from the start so very serious about it and get it as right as possible, so that even if we make mistakes, the trust is still there. Because we're not going to be able to do everything. We're technically not cybersecurity experts. We're not data privacy experts, other than the one expert that's on the team. That one I will rely on him. But even he is not like, it's one person, right? So we try our best. And as we scale, we hope that the team gets larger and is better able to handle a lot of the cybersecurity, the encryption, the data privacy, the consent, and make that a holistic aspect of a lot of what we're doing. But for now, the only thing we can really do is just to make sure that we put a lot of serious effort and consideration and thought into it.
I love that, you're doing the storage locally and then the encryption, and you have customized models to deal with healthcare data.
Yeah.
What else do people who are in a very obscure space as an AI consultant in healthcare need to prepare for when you're diving deep into whatever you're doing now?
I think the analogy I used before in one of the other talks that I gave was, again, developing the AI model is just figuring out how to build a car. A lot of people in the space don't really need to know how to build the car. They need to know how to drive the car, which means they need to know how to use the model. So it genuinely does depend. If you're talking about consultants who are building the car, then you are, yes, effectively an engineer. But now you have to know, number one, who is going to be driving the car, how are they going to be driving the car, and whether or not you're going to be able to cater for that. And then number two, the surrounding infrastructure of where the car is going to be driven and how you can then...
Where do you get your gas?
Where do you get
What
your
are
gas?
The roads,
Yes. If you have a Range Rover, easier to get through the forest. Harder to get through the forest with with a supercar. F1 just passed, right?
It's not about speed.
It's not about the speed, but F1 cars all run on roads. And when the infrastructure is built, when your roads are built, when your city is built, when your road signs are and everything is there, it's a lot easier to navigate in that space. And right now for AI, we're in this sort of wild, wild world, wild, wild west kind of situation where the roads are just starting to get built. We are just starting to come to consensus on what we should be doing moving forward and how we should be treating a lot of things. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. And so being conscious of that becomes very important. AI is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think it was Timothy actually yesterday during the dinner that Dexter mentioned, who is like effectively what I like to call an AI minimalist, which is if you don't need to use it, don't use it. There's plenty of other tools that you can use in order to solve a problem. AI might help. It also might not. If you really don't need to use the tool, you don't have to. You can if you want to, but be conscious of the limitations that come with the tool and then be relatively upfront, I think, about the limitations that come with that. So easy example is, okay, well, one of our clients comes in, wants us to build an AI model for this thing. The first thing I will personally look at as a consultant is to look at it and just go, do you really need this AI tool? I don't think it makes sense for people to spend money on something if it's not actually going to solve a larger problem. With that said, there is a caveat that obviously a lot of funding and money is going to AI-powered stuff. And so it's almost a checkbox that you'll need to fit, where it's like, yes, we'll just say this is AI-powered and then just move forward with it. And for those projects, I'll look at it and just be like, this is a way you can still use the AI tool and automate like some level of back-end operation to make it a little bit more straightforward. And then you can say that it's AI-powered. But in all honesty, the problem that you're solving is good enough and you really don't need AI to address it. So then it genuinely depends on the client, where they're going and what they want to do with it. Yeah, but I've never been one of those people that will be like, you should AI everything. Despite my PhD being in AI, obviously, I approach it as usual, like a tool. You can use the tool for some things, you can't use the tool for a lot of other things. And I hold a lot of respect for the people that understand when to use the tool versus when not to use the tool.
I love the problem centricity. It's one of our core values. Don't just force the technology on other people. Yes. But then how can healthcare organizations, hospitals, or are they clinics, or, is it the regulatory bodies that handle the governance over these things? What does good infrastructure look like to you?
There was a phrase that came to mind from a paper I read recently, which is that a model, and it was a model on DDPM, denoising, diffusion, probabilistic models, which has nothing to do with this conversation, but there was a phrase in it that said that the model had to be flexible but tractable, which means that the model has to be flexible to account for a wide variety of situations, but it has to be tractable, which means that we should be able to control and work with it. And I think that applies in this case. An infrastructure, as much as possible, should be flexible but tractable. So it should be able to adapt to a lot of the innovations potentially that are coming in with artificial intelligence, not just on a technical perspective, but also from a culture and adaptation perspective, because the truth of it is incorporating these technologies are going to take a lot of time and effort and money and resources, and everybody needs to be sort of mostly behind this effort. So flexible, adaptable, but also tractable and controllable by the people that are in charge, the leaders who are able to view things from a third-party perspective and just make sure that, the direction that you're going with building this infrastructure and this ecosystem and this sandbox is great, is good, and that we're not just catering to immediate trends, but that we're providing genuine and actual value in the infrastructure that we're building. I think that phrase tends to encapsulate a lot of it. That's what I hope to see. I think other people might have different opinions. This is just my personal opinion. But again, this is primarily coming from the perspective of an innovator that just likes to plunk stuff in there.
That's admirable. And this is all conversation around leadership and change management and transforming the culture. And even in industries outside of healthcare, when it's less regulated and there are less lives at stake. I mean, productivity stuff and all those kinds of tools, but it's already hard to do, a digital transformation. It's not even AI, just normal digital transformation that focuses on actual problems being solved.
Yes.
So, how can you paint a picture of what it's like if you're like in actual healthcare, how hard it really is?
It is difficult. I'm not going to say it's not, but the thing is, and this may confuse some people, but that difficulty makes me happy. That difficulty means there are people who are conscientious about the quality of the work that we need to put out. That difficulty means that we need to be very careful and very deliberate about the work that we're putting out in healthcare and artificial intelligence. That difficulty means that there are barriers at stake to protect the people that need to be protected the most, even though it might be blocking things for others at large. Like, I understand that there are some trade-offs with this high level of limitation, but especially in healthcare, where you're working with lives at stake, as you said at the start of this podcast, I'm very glad that there are so many people who are taking a view of it and being effective and critical blockers for these types of technologies. Because if we have already established a standard of care, which has at this point in healthcare taken us anywhere between like 10 to multiple decades to really establish that standard of care, to replace it with something new, it's not going to be easy to convince that many people and that many stakeholders, the patients, the clinicians, your administration, your payees, your entire healthcare ecosystem, your government and everything. We're not going to be that easily convinced, right? If your solution goes wrong, and maybe from a numbers perspective, if you look at things from a numbers perspective, maybe that makes sense. But if you look at it from another perspective, like, you're still working in a situation where a single life matters. And so if we make even a single mistake with that technology, right, that one life that you sacrificed is worth a lot more than losing $1 in this particular perspective. And so, of course, it's going to take a long time. And even though it frustrates me sometimes, a level of potentially unnecessary bureaucracy or confusion around it right now anyway, because it's not so obvious, I'm glad that it's there, and I'm glad that it's protecting the people that need to be protected, who can't advocate for themselves because they don't understand what they're looking at. They trust healthcare professionals, and therefore it's in the right of the healthcare professionals to be doubtful and judgmental of the technologies and the tools that they're going to be working with, because they are in effect representing the people that they are treating. And so that's fine, as long as they're working with me and I can work with them and we can speak to each other, and our common ground here is that over time we just want better outcomes for the people. We understand the limitations of adapting this new technology. We work together to make it trustworthy and acceptable, and that it does meet the gold standards that it needs to in healthcare. And as long as we can get everybody on board with that, and as long as we can prove that it can be trustworthy, even if it takes time, that's a lot better than trying to rush it through, making all of those mistakes and accidentally, or not so accidentally and very recklessly, affecting outcomes in a more adverse way. I didn't want to outright say, like, kill
That
people.
someone dies.
Yeah, I didn't want to outright say that. I don't want to outright say not
I will say
everything.
it.
Not everything directly affects mortality. A lot of things can affect mortality, which is the death rate. A lot of things can. A lot of other things can affect the quality of life. Can affect other outcomes, disease incidents, and all disease progression, and all of that stuff. That can still affect it. It's not quite death, but it is still adverse outcomes, and so we do want to be very careful about that. And I think that's okay. Yeah.
It's very serious planning.
Yes.
And I what I'm hearing is you love the status quo. It's because that's what it takes to really develop something. Not fast, but slow and steady is what matters because people's lives are at stake.
I think to differentiate building the car and building multiple new kinds of models and then testing out all of those models should be encouraged. I think as many situations as possible should be encouraged to make that happen, and we should allow that to bloom. Saying that any one of those models should be the model everybody drives, though, is a different story entirely, because that's more about the roads and the infrastructure and the people in that system, as opposed to building the model itself, which is a different problem entirely. And so I encourage as much as possible all of this innovation, but I also encourage as much as possible a very conscious decision to implement and to be aware that when you attempt to implement, you're not just saying that I have this AI model, I want to plunk it into this thing, and then I just want it to work, and then I just want to forget about it. That's not what the healthcare system is about. The healthcare system is about working with the people, and model implementation is actually more about adoption, trust, and ownership of that model and that effort by the clinicians and the innovators that work with them, as well as the patients themselves and the clinicians, to move it forward rather than just saying that here's a tool, here's a thing, take it or leave it, right? So it's a very different effort, and it's
a very collaborative.
It's a very collaborative effort for sure. But again, because it takes so long, once it's in, it's in. It's one of those types of systems.
It's irreversible.
Some of it's reversible. It's not always irreversible, but a lot of it is very hard to displace, in the same way that a lot of our gold standard of care is very hard to displace. Not all of the gold standard, not all of the so-called gold standard of care is actually technically the best, but we've done our best as medical systems go to really put in place as many fail-safes as possible, whether or not people think they're necessary, especially from the innovator side.
Tell me about the fail-safes, because that's an important concept as a AI consultant in this space, right?
Right. The regulations don't quite exist for AI itself yet, but the multiple levels of clinical trials should effectively prove it through. I'm not going to get this right because I'm not in pharma, but if I'm not wrong, and please forgive me, anybody that's in pharma, but if I'm not wrong, like the first steps of having a new drug, for instance, is a situation where you test it on live animals, and then you vaguely make sure that, okay, on animals, it's okay. There's no toxicity or whichever. And then you move on to humans, and that's with a small cohort of humans. And you test, I think, two things, which is whether or not it's going to be safe, and then whether or not it's going to work and do the thing it actually does. And then number two is whether or not it's actually going to cause any side effects and adverse events or toxicity and whatnot. Once that's sort of mostly over, you set an initial threshold, and the stricter the threshold, the better it is. Once that passes, then you pass into a phase 2 trial. And then after that, you sort of scale it up, and you'll start looking for things like long-term effects, larger sample sizes and whatnot. And then the third clinical trial where you effectively start assessing it in other I think demographics, children, older adults, a more extensive number sample size before you really move it into attempting actual public acceptance. So for pharmaceuticals, that process takes anywhere between 15 to 20 million and like 10 to 15 years before a drug is like from the lab to the market. And of course, it's a giant industry, that's pharma. SAMD works on a different scale, right? But that's an example of some of the very extensive fail-safes that we do put in place. Now, it is also true that in some environments, that bureaucracy makes the whole process very bloated, which I don't enjoy, because the process is very fragmented. And anybody who's worked on medical devices or SAMD will know this. SAMD maybe not so much, but medical hardware devices is easier to see. Let's say you're a researcher, and you have some kind of core technology and you want to productize that. Never mind commercialize it, productize it. You just want to make a product from it, right? You just want to take it to the manufacturing. As a researcher, you have no idea where to start. If you're lucky, your university has one of these translational programs that they can sort of guide you through the thing. But usually that has a commercial aspect to it and not just productization. So that you then end up having to focus on like a lot of the commercial type
More process.
Yeah. So productization itself. You have your core IP. Where do you start with productization? Do you start by hopefully you start by first talking to users, but a lot of people typically jump into going straight for working with an industrial designer.
Yeah.
Industrial designers, mechanical engineers, electronics engineers to start building a prototype. Maybe you need the prototype in order to talk to users. That's fine. It's sort of a funky little cycle. You're a designer, you know. So it's sort of this funky little cycle. Design, develop, prototype, MVP, test with users, hopefully, and then you iterate it multiple times. Hopefully, design, develop. You iterate it multiple times before you get to a point where you can do DFM, which is design for manufacture. And then that you can also take into then the manufacturing process. But throughout this whole process, your designer typically is one person. Your developer, your engineers are typically another person. They're not designers, and developers usually can end up in the same agency, but not always. A lot of the times you can have industrial designers that won't develop prototypes. And then you have to go and find a separate prototyper. And then if your device has multiple parts to it, maybe this designer will design one part of it or just the outside, and then they have to outsource the other parts. The easiest thing, a lot of industrial designers will design just the outside, and then they'll have somebody else do the electronics, which means it's still two different agencies working on the same product, right? And so you have to handle two different agencies. So assuming that's fine, but then assuming you don't really like this designer and you don't really like this design and it's not that effective, and in your mind you're like, not great, then you have to go through the same process with another agency again. There are not that many, really. You have to go through the same process, or you go through the same agency and you have to go through it multiple times over and over again. If you shift to a different agency, now the new agency has to come in and think about your whole problem and go and figure out the same problems that the old agencies have encountered and attempted to solve, whether
like
successful or not.
Like a new onboarding process for the whole context.
Effectively, but you have to redo it over and over again. And then you get to a process where you're like, okay, maybe this can go to manufacture. Even if you want to manufacture 50 different products, there's no way in heck it's going to be the same person, right? So now you have these agencies and they have to work with the manufacturers to do this thing called design for manufacture. And design for manufacture may or may not be the same agencies doing it. It may also be a third party. And then on top of that, you have to do your marketing, different agency, branding, may or may not be the same agency, website, different agency, more of your startup commercialization stuff, accelerator type work, different agency, different situation, procurement, different situation.
That's so much bloat though.
Yeah. It's so much
and that's not
correct.
even AI.
Correct. None of that is software. That's all hardware. And technically, like hardware is harder, but software companies or a lot of software-based researchers tend to face the same problem, which is where, okay, well, I have this core IP, and let's say the core IP is in AI. But just because you know how to build AI does not mean you know how to do software engineering.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the things that I get from my clients are, I didn't know there was a company out there that actually does this, which is number one. So there's no brand awareness that there's software development agencies or that's what is actually needed. And then number two is once you have that, there's still a bunch of other stuff that you have to do on top of building the product. And those are all different people. And you have to manage all of these different processes. And that's not including regulations, which is another set of agencies. Regulations, standardization, certifications, etc., everything. It's a nightmare. Clinical trials are another agency entirely, or like another situation entirely. And so trying to you can see already, trying to tackle this whole process, this whole giant pipeline, all of which almost always has to happen at some level in parallel, is very daunting for a researcher. Like you think like, okay, I make a startup.
You were just going to focus on the model.
Yeah.
But then now you have to do...
everything else is coming on board. And so one of the reasons why we set up the company in the first place was as an effort to tackle everything for our clients, to streamline that pipeline and that process. We were advised against it because trying to tackle a whole pipeline is it's
crazy.
It's insane. It's not niche, and it's technically not scalable, really, because, again, you're tackling so many different things, and there's so much variation that you're not going to be able to 100x it for the most part. But that wasn't my goal. My goal is to create the pipeline that was so simple and so straightforward that anybody could push things through as quickly as possible. And so a huge part of our effort is to streamline things like documentation, which is usually something that a lot of clinicians towards the end, when they need the documentation, they have to go back and like hit up all of the other agencies that they worked with, like, I don't know, 2 to 5 years ago, and just be like, do you have the documentation for this?
And they don't.
They may or may not have. If they're good enough, if they're good enough and they're established enough and they know what they're doing with medical, then they've kept the documentation. And ideally, they would have sent a copy of the documentation to the client when they offboarded. But with a lot of research, when you don't have that much money and you're not engaging people that are that expensive or that experienced or that good, they don't always keep the documentation. Now you have to go back and like try and figure out whether or not you can make it, put it together, pull something together from prior documentation, recreate the documents or whatnot. It's a nightmare. Software documentation is a bit easier because you have things like GitHub, Docker, etc. to keep track of all your version control and changes, right? So you can keep track of that. But then you also sort of need to keep track of like the experiments for your clinical trials and publications, and that's a separate problem entirely. And then you also have to keep track of a level of documentation that's needed for any IP work that you might be doing, which is not common for AI, but we work with electronics as well. So you do need to keep it for that. And then on top of that, regulations, and you need to meet those as much as possible. So you need to sort of semi-predict what's going on with the regulations, work backwards from there, and then just as much as possible try to predict that this is probably the regulation that we're going to be working with, this country, potentially here and there. Let's just keep this set of documentation.
And the regulations localized depending on where you want to operate to. Right?
Yes. So I'm assuming for the most part that, okay, if it's a Singaporean client, they're probably going to want to deploy it locally. If it's an Indonesian client, they're going to want to do it there. Yeah. And that usually tends to be, okay, whichever. We keep a standardized document for a lot of our documentation, and then just take it from there and move it away. A lot of people think I'm very... Okay, I'm not going to use the word that I was going to use. A lot of the people think I'm very particular. You know what word I was going to use. Particular about the documentation. Like every move I make, every command I type, it's recorded effectively, because I don't want a situation where in my publication or in somebody else's publication, they look at this and they go, why did you use this like this? And then I just can't remember. So every decision I make, I insist, like, please document this.
Now I understand.
Yes.
During that one call. When we were onboarding Eve.
Yes.
But this is so helpful. Evelyn, I would love to talk more, but
yes,
I have to ask you the last question, yes, or else they will kick us out. What's your advice to people who want to join this healthcare ecosystem? What's top of mind for you? For the builders, the operators, the future peers or current peers that you have in healthcare AI consulting?
I would love for them to join us. Make sure that it's a conscious decision when you do join it. Make sure that you understand what you're looking at. Make sure that you, even if you're not aware of the intricacies of it, make sure that you know you're looking at a beast that you are not even really trying to figure out how to tame. You're just trying to figure out how to ride the bull at this point.
Or look at it.
Or really just look at it, yes. You may not be trying to, again, build a car. You may be just trying to learn how to drive the car, but if you remember how to drive a car, if you remember you're learning on how to drive a car, that was pretty difficult too. And it's still, the longer you do it, the better you drive a car. Building the car, different story. Building the rest of the city and the infrastructure, also different story. But we need more people to do that. It's just, more of it is definitely just be aware of what you are potentially committing to. There's a lot of so-called bells and whistles that, it's not bells and whistles, but there are a lot of things about healthcare that draw people in, this drive to save, which is very admirable. But you're going to burn yourself out if that's the only thing that you're coming in with, because the field is intensely exhausting, and I'm not going to deny it. That is the genuine and very real truth of it. I'm not going to deny it. I love it. I still love the field. I hope more people join it. I just hope that when people join it, they are very careful about why they choose to move forward with it, and that they have a drive that will keep them going even as the infrastructure and the bureaucracy frustrates them. And so if you have that overarching push to make this impact, knowing the obstacles you're going to face, you are more than welcome. We love you. We want more of you. Please come. And please don't leave. Please don't jump to finance.
All right. Thank you so much, Eve. That's the intentionality behind the decision making,
Yes.
the awareness of what you're going to ride or drive, or you're not going to tame it for sure. But yeah, and
not anymore. You can tame a car.
yeah, but finally, the real ambition or the push or whatever you want to call it, the hustle or the life purpose that draws you into it, take it seriously. Because if you don't have it, you're going to burn out.
Yes, very much.
Eve, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you, Alexis. Really, really enjoyed being on the show with you. It was wonderful.
You're welcome.